October 20th, 2021, two young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods in Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiancé Chris, and their friends Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety like the panther that was apparently prowling all over Henderson County. Nonetheless, Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago. Ever since, he told Jake he'd been nervous walking around his property outside, and so he'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he too was now carrying a gun around for the same reason when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen. She asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. Now, obviously, Chris was not thrilled about going into the woods at night, but he loved his fiancée and would do anything for her, and he had his gun. So he said he would go. Jake said, hold on a minute. He grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddy's back. Jake and Chris set out on the little path that connected their two homes. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. But now, something just felt different. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. And so the two men turned to face the noise, and as they did, they heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. And so the two men looked at each other with wide eyes, and without saying a word, they both knew they were thinking the same thing. It's the panther. And so the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush. The bush continued to shake like whatever it was gonna leap out. And so the men just opened fire, and they kept on shooting until they heard a new horrible sound. And the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out that was not a panther. After Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near that pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen, but as she did, she stepped on a twig. And at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. And that combination of noises signaled to the guys this was the panther, and if they didn't act, it might attack them. And so they drew their guns and they began to shoot until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death.